Living my bucolic life, we every city strife. Horses, chicks, and dogs, they are my neighbors. I cook and some spin, and move the horses into the barn. Then time to move them out again. Red barns, green pastures, beautiful my houses. The view I see each day when I arise. This life pleases me, as it is plain to see. I'm living my bucolic life.
Good morning, and welcome to part 2 of making Butterick 6843. I think, if I remember right, that today's going to be more about sleeves. I get a little off track with some trim. Don't worry, I correct the error of my ways later. And just whatever it comes in after that. So I hope you like it. Bye-bye. Okay, so we have the big sleeve front piece as altered, the sleeve back piece as altered, and a sleeve tab piece. It's like one of those you roll up your sleeve and you button it up things. That's what this is. You set this aside for a minute, and I need to make a pleat down here on my sleeve front. So what I'm actually going to do is go ahead and thoroughly mark my dots, my pleat marking, my stitching line for this. So anyhow, what I'm going to do, like I just said, is mark everything. So I've got sleeve placement dots up here. I've got pleat marks down here. Once I have it all marked, and these placket dots here, once I have it all marked, I will make my pleat and then serge around each piece by itself. Okay, so I have clipped my notches and I have marked all of these dots on the wrong side, okay? The pleats I'm marking on the right side because that's usually they have the pleat directions and everything marked as you would look at it from the right side. So it is just easier to do it this way. And again, I'm using my pen. It's a heat erasable pen that will disappear as soon as I iron it, so I can draw all over this and I don't have to worry about it. And as you can tell, I do tend to overmark, but it usually saves me a hassle in the long run. So we can tell from the pattern that on this side, let's see, this side, this pleat is coming this way, all right, because that's the way that the arrow is pointed. So what that means is I'm going to fold it on this line and match up that folded line to this folded line. Oops, and put a pin in it right like that. And then I'll do the same thing on this one, fold up this line, bring it over to this line here, and stick a pin in that. Okay, just like that. And this is thick fabric and pleats can be a little finicky, so just to make sure I have everything where I want it to be, I am going to go ahead and just hand baste them down. And then I can always pull out my basting stitches later. Grab my thimble as I do. And I'm just going to be basting it about 1/8 of an inch in, all the way up that pleat. So I get to the top, I'm just going to take one more stitch in a totally random direction because changing direction helps to lock things in more. Something I learned in knitting. Okay, so I'll do this other one here and then I will go ahead and serge all the way around all of my sleeve, both my sleeve pieces. So I've got these done. The only mark on this smaller side was just for the placket. So I've got those serged, everything's good there. What I'm going to do right now is skip ahead and sew my, what are they calling this, sleeve tab. And just making sure it is a 5/8 inch seam that I'm going to be sewing. So there are 2 of them. And How do they want it? Okay. So basically I'm just going to fold it in half, sew it at a 5/8 inch up, down, and all the way. Just because there are a lot of corners here, and sometimes it's hard to gauge exactly where to end when you're making corners. And especially for something like this where it's going to be painfully obvious if I make a mistake, I am drawing them in. So using my handy dandy ruler here, it would have been easier without that pin there. I'm just drawing this line at 5/8 all the way over. So now I have my stitching line, and that's going to be helpful. For I'm going to do both of them and go ahead and sew them and then trim them. Okay, so with those trimmed, with those stitched, I'm going to come back here and trim it to a little less than a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, and I'm going to try to take some bulk out of where these corners are. I'm going to flip these right side out. Okay, so I'm going to use my little lobster claw turner for this. And I push it on, there's a round side and a pointy side. Push it onto the round side, up to the end. Close it up. And then very carefully move everything over to the other side. Sometimes getting it started is the hardest part. Okay, once it peeks through, I can pull it off and just pull it the rest of the way. I'm going to stick my chopstick in here and push out those corners, and it's ready for pressing. Alright, so they do not ask you to top stitch it, but after I pressed it, it is fairly flat. You know, the linen that I'm using is nice and firm, so I don't think that's a problem. But now I need to put a buttonhole in here before I do anything else, which means I actually have to go to my button stash and figure out what I'm going to use. I should have done that before. And it means that I also need to figure out how many buttons I'm going to need. So let me go do all of that, and I'll show you what I find. Okay, so the buttons that I'm going to be using, again, using up what I have a lot of, and I have a lot of these. So the long sleeve with the little tab version uses 14 buttons. So this is what I'm going to be using. They are little pink, clear, shanked buttons, and they're 3/8 of an inch. And I think that that's going to be okay. It might be a little bit smaller than what they were calling for, but it's still somewhat in the ballpark. So that will be all right. So I'm going to go gear up my buttonholer and make some buttons. But first I need to mark where they want them. So what I'm going to do is mark the beginning point. I'm not going to mark the ending point because my buttonhole is going to be narrower than theirs, but I want to know where I should be starting from. So I'm going to place it over here so that my seam allowances are off the edges, and it looks like it's pretty much in line with these points there. Okay, so that's where my buttonhole is going to start, and I'm going to draw a line for its path because I need that for my buttonholer. The path is important. I'll put a little crosshatch where it begins. Okay, so I'm using my Singer 15 as my buttonhole machine because the treadle is tired right now. We're just using the treadle for quilting. I am using a 3/8 inch cam, popping it in here, and going to go ahead and hook it up. So let me go ahead and get this attached, and I have a scrap fabric to do a test buttonhole on before I use my actual real ones, just to make sure everything looks good, and I'll show you how that works. Alright, so I made a test buttonhole using the 3/8 inch size, and this is a 3/8 inch button, but it's fat. And I want my buttonhole to be barely big enough for this button to squeeze through, because I'm going to be using the same buttonhole size for up and down the front. And the last thing I want is to have loose buttonholes in the front where they might pop open, if you know what I mean. So I did the 3/8 and I clipped it open, and it is just too narrow. I can't squeeze it through. So I'm going to have to go up a size. So what that means is I need to pop this whole thing out again and get a different cam. But I just wanted to let you know, sometimes you just have to try things out before you commit to it. Alright, so I just ran another practice buttonhole at 1/2 inch, and I think that that is the one that's going to work. Because it's tight enough that it's a little tricky to pull it through, but it comes through nicely, and I think that that's what I'm going to feel comfortable with. So I'm going to go ahead and make my buttonholes. And if you ever use one of these, you probably know that the bottom of this is very, very grabby. And it has to be, because it's maneuvering everything. But if you have a fabric that you're worried about, I just save pieces of pattern paper or, you know, tissue paper that's very sheer, and I can see my mark through there. And that gives me a good place to start. So I have another video showing all about this buttonholer if you're interested. Okay, so before I put these pieces away, I'm going to actually draw the stitching line on here. It looks like the first one is a 1/4 inch in and the second is 3/8. So I am just going to draw those on there so I know exactly where everything needs to be. So that one's a 1/4 inch, and then 3/8 from that point is here. Okay, so now I can go ahead and put this piece away. And you can kind of see the place where I'm going to put it is centered with my center top dot up here. But that places it right in the middle of all of my expanding here. So instead of marking it out here, I'm actually going to mark it pretty much right where my stitching starts. So that's where I'm going to, where my pattern adjustment places start. So this is the place here where I'm actually going to be punching those holes. I have so many layers of Scotch tape that even my hole puncher doesn't want to go through it. Isn't that funny? Okay, so now I can take these marks and transfer these onto my sleeve pieces. Okay, so now I am transferring these marks to the wrong side of my sleeve piece. And that should match up with these, like that. So I was thinking that they wanted me to stitch this and then turn it and stitch like that, but they don't. They want me to leave the raw edge open. And I don't want to leave my raw edge open. So I am actually going to run over and serge across my raw edges just because this stuff frays so much. And then I'm just going to place it just like this and sew straight across those stitching lines. Okay, so this is where it's actually sewn, and it's pretty well invisible here. On the other side you can see where I have it stitched down with my 2 rows. And now it's time to go ahead and sew this seam over here connecting my back sleeve to my front sleeve. It's just a basic side seam. I'm going to sew it straight down at a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then press it open. Okay, so just to let you guys know, this whole little opening on the sleeve, the instructions are kind of whacked. So this is how I interpret it. If you have just serged down the sides, what they want you to do is just fold it in 5/8 and then just kind of stretch it out without clipping. I don't like that. I don't like the way that it is. And see if you can even see the picture. It's a little bit whacked where they say, don't clip it, just stretch it. Okay, so that's one set of instructions. Now they have instructions if you did not serge it. This is actually the one I'm going to do, but as you can see, part of it is turned in doubles, part of it is turned in single. So this is fun. Okay, so the first, and it looks like on here, they don't tell you and they don't give you a mark, but it looks like the amount that is turned in doubled is roughly the same height as our pleat. So I'm using that as a guide, okay? Because our pleat is already in here. So I clipped to what they say is within 3/8 of the circle, which is good. So then you turn it under 1/4 inch, all right? Now what they're going to have you do is just pin this top part in where it is turned under just the 1/4 inch. Now the bottom part, which is the same amount as this cuff, which looks like a couple inches, okay? They want that one to be turned in twice. In the picture, they have the little pin head sticking out a bit, so I'll do that too, just to humor them. Okay, so basically, this is turned in twice, this is just turned in once. I'm not sure of their reasoning for it, but we're just going with it right now just to see what happens. So that's how I'm going to pin all 4 sides. And I'm actually going to come back and just baste these because it looks like, oops, it looks like there's a whole lot of maneuvering with cuffs and everything, and I'm thinking that my pins are going to get knocked between now and then. So I'm just going to come back in here and baste this folded part so that it can hold in place and I can pull these pins out. So I'll be doing that on all sides also. Okay, and one last thing on this. As I was basting, when I got up here, I just tucked that little serged edge under. So basically you're going from fat to thin. I think that's what they're going to be getting at, but I just was not comfortable with that exposed serged edge up here. Just didn't feel right to me. So that's how I did it. And I'll be doing that again on all the others, and I just have it basted. We'll see what they do with it, but I like that better. Okay, so I have, we left off at chapter 17, and then it goes into cuffs, and they want you to put on the cuffs and everything, and then you get all the way through cuffs, and you end up way over here at chapter 28. And they say now, after the cuffs are on and everything, now they want you to go ahead and hand stitch or top stitch this opening, which is what we just did. And it seems to me like it would be a whole lot easier to do that now. So I'm going to do that now. I'm this that I had basted shut, and I pressed it so it's a nice sharp edge here. I'm just going to top stitch right around the edge of that. And so that I could pull those basting stitches out and be done with it. I don't really see a point in waiting until after I have the cuff on to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. I'm using my top stitching foot, which has a little guide that runs along the edge of 1/16 of an inch in. And that way I can get a uniform top stitch. But I'm loving this because usually if I'm going to start right here, this is where it's going to want to bunch up with thread. So since I have my little scrap there, I don't have to worry about that. And I just wanted to point out, if you don't have that, you still can keep from getting one of those little nests by just, these are my 2 threads, just kind of loosely hang on to them as you get it started. And that'll do the same thing. So there you go. Okay, so I've got these all top stitched on. Let me find an edge here. So it looks like this now, and I've pulled out my basting stitches, so I'm happy with this now. I think that that's a good place to be. So I'm getting down to the cuffs, and it looks like they're giving you 2 different sets of instructions on putting the cuffs in, and they let you choose which one you want. One of them, This one down here with their pro tip looks like what they're trying to get you to do is, instead of understitching to make sure that the seamed edge curl in, they're having you trim the facing side in a little bit so that the facing side is shorter. It's going to make it cinch in on its own. And I think that's what I'm going to do. The other one just looks pretty basic, and so this is different. So we're going to do that. So the first thing I did is fuse that same very, very lightweight interfacing to both of my cuffs. You have 2 cuff pieces, one for each sleeve. They're just a single piece cuff. Okay, so folding it exactly in half and pressing it after I have my interfacing fused to it. Okay, I'm going to pick which side is going to be my facing. So I'm going to say this side is, you know, just kind of arbitrarily here. And it says that they want you to cut it so that it's 1/8 of an inch shorter on each side, tapering to nothing at the fold line. And you know what? I don't need to draw that. I can eyeball that. So basically up here where I have 1/8 of an inch, I just grading it out to nothing. And I was not at all perfect with my interfacing, so I'm going to go ahead and trim that extra off there. And the same thing over here, I'm just, from my 1/8 of an inch mark, I'm just going to trim it to nothing and then cut my sloppy interfacing off there. Okay, so, but I need to remember which side I did that to, so I'm going to put a letter F for facing on the side that I trimmed. Okay, so for the cuff, there's a lot of markings, but I'm not transferring them all yet. I'm actually just doing these here, or actually these. The one that has the buttonholes and the button placement, that's the right side. The one that doesn't have them, that's the facing. That's how I'm going with it. So what I've marked is everything that has to do with joining these. So I've done the circles on the side, the little square here, and that notch. So the circle lines up with the very edge, okay? So I'm going to pin that one. Notch lines up with notch, obviously. This square here lines up with the seam line between the 2 sleeves. And this other circle lines up again with the very edge of the fabric. Okay, so I'm going to do both sleeves like that, come back in here and stitch straight across at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Some easing in here. It looks like that we need to work in. I'm not going to run easing stitches. I'm just going to let the feed dogs do that. So again, I will sew it so that my cuff is on top, this is on the bottom, and hold it nice and firm. And the feed dogs that grab the fabric, they'll just work that in for me. All right, so you might be able to tell there's quite a bit of ease that I had to work in here. And I actually got all the way through and had one little pucker, and it was driving me nuts. So instead of working on the back, I pulled out that little section and I worked it in on this side. And I just wanted to show you, if you're easing on this side, sometimes if you pull, because you're wanting those threads to get closer, you can pull them apart and push it together at the same time. So it's kind of like a pull and work thing down the side. But sometimes if this side doesn't work perfectly for you and you really need to see what's going on here, it is possible. But this is a very, very thick, very firm linen, and it doesn't have any stretch to it. But usually if you're working with the fabric that has a little bit of stretch, if you just pull it tight, it's going to want to cinch the threads together, and that's another way of easing. But you know, I got it in there, and so I think I'm ready for the next step. Okay, so now I am actually going to press a few things. I'm going to press this whole seam allowance down into my cuff. Now it does not say to grade this, but this is a lot of thickness to me. And so I am going to. And the part that I'm going to trim more is the part that's on the sleeve here. If I leave this, this is my outside, okay? And I'm going to leave this one the longest because that's going to kind of be like a buffer between all the short stuff in here, and this has a lot of substance to it, I would say. So if I trim this shorter, this will act kind of like a facing to the facing to keep any of those ridges from showing. So with that said, I'm going to take it down, probably about 1/4 inch in here. And I can go ahead and pull out my basting stitches in that little pleat there too. What I also need to do is, while I'm at the ironing board, I kind of drew a line at 5/8. What I need to do is press that at exactly 5/8 all the way down, and then come back and also trim this side. So since I trimmed this to about 1/4 inch and this is 5/8, I'm going to trim this side so it's about a 3/8 inch seam allowance here. So then that way it should stagger it all the way down. Okay, so I've got this all pressed, and I'm actually going to trim it with my pinking shears because that zigzag will give it the vague sense of we don't actually know where it's going to end. So we can't see a line because it could be anywhere type of mysticism that it is. Okay, so now remember we trimmed this side narrower. So if I fold it up and I'm matching my edges here, and I want to make sure when I fold it that my facing side is at least enough to cover where this side is. Okay, I don't want to be able to see my underside. All right, I don't want it way up higher, but I don't want to be able to see it. And on this side also, I'm not worrying about pinning the middle, but over on this side, I'm going to pin it so it's at that same height over here too. And I'm going to sew these two edges, 5/8 at the bottom, and make sure that I end up right here where my fabric is, right there. So what is that, out of curiosity? Now that I've moved everything around and trimmed things down, it looks like it's just about 1/2 inch. So I'm just going to draw a line, just because I can. So I'm going to sew this and this one over here and lock it in. And then I need to do the other sleeve just the same. Alrighty, so I'm going to trim the bulk out of there. I'm going to grade these edges, putting one at about 1/4 inch, one at about 3/8 of an inch. Do that on both sides of the sleeve. Now I'm going to turn it right side out. Get my chopstick to help turn out those bottom points. And because we trimmed the facing, the center of this should be shorter. The wrong side should be shorter than the right side. So what I'm going to do is just slightly turn in the edges. See how this is my wrong side, and I'm rolling it in so it's towards the inside about 1/8 of an inch, because that's what we trimmed. So that's what I'm going to assume it will be. And I'm going to do that for this side also. Kind of roll it in about 1/8 of an inch there. And pin that. Okay. And because I pulled in that 1/8 on each side, this part should be pretty flat, and it looks like it is. So that's how that's going to work. Okay, so I've got it all pinned in, and it is pretty flat. I could top stitch it, but because there's no other top stitching on this, well, except for right here, and that kind of blends, I think I'm just going to do it by hand straight across here. That won't take very much time, and I can do it pretty invisibly. So I'm going to do that for both of the sleeves. Okay, so I've got this all stitched under, and I almost forgot I was going to put trim on this thing. So I am going to put my trim on. I know it's a slightly different shade of purple, but you know what? Trim is fun, and we can be fun. We can be different. You know what? Okay, hold on a second. Let me see, how bad would it be just to slit that? It's not bad at all. That is going to be perfect. Okay, so new plan. I'm just going to slit it open, run my trim, and then when I go to sew it, I will just sew that closed. I think that's going to work out great. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is cut a strip of the stitch witchery that is the length of my cuff. And now I'm going to, this is 1/2 inch wide. I'm going to trim it down the middle so I have 2 strips that are this length that are 1/4 inch. Because that's the size of my trim. Okay. Put one aside here for right now. I have just randomly decided to make my placement 3/4 of an inch from my edge down. I think that that's going to work out well for me. So I'm just going to lay my stitch witchery over that line. Get my trim. I'm going to stick the end out a little bit and press. So I can just lay my trim down on top of that stitch witchery and press it. Okay, so now it's on there pretty well. Okay, so this is the side that I cut the little slit in. I'm just going to take some of this off. Tuck that edge in, and well, it's not going to go anywhere. I'm just going to leave it like that for right now, and I'll do the same thing over here. I'll slice that open, tuck this edge in. Okay, so this is my little test piece, and I put it on with a zigzag stitch with a matching thread, and I think it's pretty much invisible. So that's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to go ahead and run this on here with a zigzag stitch, and when I get to the ends, I think that my zigzag that's going to hold this on will also kind of seal that end, and if I feel like I need to, I can do a couple little invisible stitches there, but I don't know that I'm going to need to. Okay, so the cuffs are done. I've got it stitched on, and I think it's going to hold it very securely. So that's fine. Before I get into the next step, which is setting in the sleeves, I'm going to put a stay around the bottom of this bodice. And that is because the, I can't find the pattern. Well, there's just one stitching line that holds the skirt to the bodice. And there's a whole lot of weight and everything on here. And there's a chance that it could stretch out of shape. And having the stay on there, when my stay is just going to be a piece of this twill tape. Okay, what is this? 1/4 inch twill tape, okay? So the stay is going to help everything stay nice and firm and secure with no distortion. All right, so what I'm going to do is just draw my 5/8 inch seam allowance on here, so that I can place my stay tape exactly on top of it. You can see the bodice is shaped a little bit curved because of all the seams and everything. So when I go to stitch it, I will just use a straight stitch and start it down here and just pull my tape nice and tight and stitch it on. All right, so I've got it sewed on, and I wanted to make sure I worked the ease that the little outfit had stretched out just a tad when I was working on it. So I worked that ease back in, and so now I feel very secure that I can go ahead and handle this as much as I want. And this waistline is going to stay right where it needs to be. Looks like I got a little off center there, but that's okay. That is okay. So what I need to do now is, before I can set these sleeves in, I need to close them up. So I'm going to be making this seam here, straight up, 5/8 inch, and if you can see, my little dot, here we go, the little dot is actually about 1/8 of an inch in, okay, so that when I sew this way, all of this stuff is hidden in there. All the way 5/8, and then I'll stick a sleeve roll inside of here and press the seam open. I've got it sewn together. These seam allowances I've pressed open, and I went ahead and ran 2 rows of gathering stitches around the top between the 2 dots. One of the dots is at this seam where the back and front piece join. The other is, in its usual place. And before I go any further, I want to put these buttonholes onto this cuff. Actually, it probably would have been easier to do this before I sewed this seam, but it's going to be fine. I just don't want to wait until I have to manhandle the entire dress on my buttonholer over there. So the buttonholes go on the part that have the cuff, that have the pleat on it. The one that does not have the pleat, that's where the buttons go. See, I'm lining up this fold line with the edge of my cuff, and I'm going to scoot it in so that I have a seam allowance peeking out here. I'm going to mark my 2 dots where my buttonhole should be. So I have one buttonhole that's going to be above my trim and one that's going to be below. Marking these, I made my 2 little dots, but I'm going to go ahead and draw a line across where my beginning point is. Okay, so I end up with a T and a line marking the track, which is going to go straight through both dots. All right, and I know it's too long, but that's what I need. I need my starting point, and I need the track that I have to follow. All right, so I've just buttoned them onto the card here so you can see, but I actually had to move this buttonhole in some because it was so thick right here, and the buttonhole placement was very close to this, that it wasn't going to fit under my buttonholer. It was just too many layers there. So I had to move it down, which actually put it, making a buttonhole right on top of the trim, but it did fine with that. And while I have everything here handy, I'm going to go ahead and mark over on towards this side of the buttonhole where my button placement needs to be. So right there. All right, so I've got these buttons sewed on, and I think it looks quite festive. But there's one more thing I need to do with these sleeves before we can put them in, and that is sew the little button up here. I know you can't see it very well, but this is my tab stitching right here. Right there's my tab stitching. So center is right here, and I'm just going to mark it like that, and sew one more button right there. So with this all sewed on, this is how it looks for a sleeve. There's quite a few rolls of the sleeve up in here, and if you're going to do this, make sure that you finish off the edges of your seam allowances really nicely, because hey, everything shows, Okay, so I am going to set my sleeve in now. And so this is my front, this is my back. My front piece has 1 notch, my back has 2 notches, okay? So that's one way of remembering it. And so I'm just going to match those up. The seam in my sleeve is going to match with my underarm seam here. Hang on. There's a little bit to ease, so there is some easing, but I'll do this for both sleeves. I'm going to come back in here and stitch around it at 5/8 inch. Now, since this is a very fitted underarm seam, what I'm going to do is start stitching over here in the front near where this notch is, go all the way around, and then at this notch come in about 1/8 of an inch and make a second row of stitching between this notch and this notch. Oops, I need to position that better. And that's going to give a nice reinforcement stitch underneath here. All right, so I'm sewing this sleeve on. Actually, I just about to get started sewing it. And if you're like me and you have just a regular standard flat sewing machine, you can't just slide it on and go like a free arm machine. But that kind of works out because for a sleeve like this, I like to be able to look at what's happening in here while I'm sewing. And so this is my underarm seam, this is my front notch here, and I'm just going to get started right there and go all the way around. But by sewing it this way, I can kind of rotate things, you know, a little bit, get it all set up, make sure everything looks good, both sides. Go a little bit more. Make sure my seam allowances are staying the way open that I like. Go a little more, you know, and just take my time and work through it that way. So right now I'm getting into where I have my gathering stitches, so I can take my time and work it in. And if I see that it's a little too bunchy in one area, I have just a little pointy awl here that I can use to guide myself. And sometimes I can add a little extra ease somewhere and take it away somewhere just by pushing it around on my gathering stitches as I have it pinned. Alrighty, so I am going to trim between my bottom notches here where I have it double stitched. You can see 2 rows of stitching there. It's going to protect it from unraveling for me. Actually, I want to show you something kind of cool I just found. So I have this old Simplicity pattern, and I was looking at it, and it is basically the same dress. Now the skirt, that what we're making is more of a circle skirt, and this is pleated. You know, theirs is flat with pleats, but it's basically the same dress. This is a very timeless pattern that we're making here. So here are the sleeves. They're set in nicely. You know, no real gaps or puckers or anything. And we got the cuffs and everything here. So here's my back. The shoulders look like they're going to fit. And here is the back where I put the stay tape down here. So yeah, so far so good. So now we're going to get started on the skirt.